everyone. Thank you for those who've joined us early. We'll begin promptly at 2 p.m. Wonderful. So I think we are ready to get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Experian today for our webinar. A few things to cover before we get into everything. First and foremost, we're so happy that you're here. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording with the slides will be circulated. So if you're only able to listen in today, that's okay. Keep an eye out for an email from us in the next few days. That said, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function to submit questions and we'll cover them at the end, or always feel free to reach out to us and we can set up a meeting. And with that, we're ready to get started. Great, so my name is Jordan Tetler. I am the product marketing manager here at Experian. I've been with the company for a little over 5 years now, and I'm based out of Boston. I lead the thought leadership and research strategies for our business. And since I started all those years ago, I've really become fascinated with data quality and how it's really intertwined in our everyday lives. And I think that will be clear today when we look at email. And today I have John with me.
Hey everyone, thanks Jordan. So my name is John Arante. I'm a product manager at Experian. I've been with Experian, I have to check myself here. I'm working in my 8th year. I too am based in Boston. And when I began my career at Experian, I started working predominantly with retailers and really how they were using email and helping them sort of build out their email strategy, but have expanded my focus on the other verticals Experian works with as the usage of email has grown in other areas. And hey, that's the subject of this webinar. So I'm really excited to be here too.
Great, thanks so much, John. So today we want to take a deep dive into email, you guessed it, and what it looks like across the market today. So as a business, we've been in the space for over 20 years at this point, and we'll start by looking at how we've been helping businesses use email data over that time span. And we really want to do this because we think it will help understand, where we play a role in the email data management strategy. Then we'll take the time to dive into how email has actually evolved. And we also have a section on where email is becoming a key asset in specific industries. So we'll go through examples that are really interesting and what we're seeing as Experian. After that, we'll touch on best practices and technology to drive an email data management strategy. At the end, we'll open it up to questions to the audience. So please remember to use that Q&A function on your screen if any questions come up. And to get us started, I'll pass it over to John to talk about our services we offer around email, and that will give you some context around how we're really helping businesses and where we play with email.
Yes, thanks, Jordan. So when Jordan and I were kind of putting together this webinar, we thought it would be best to help the group understand what capabilities we're bringing to market first, so they can put some context around what our experience actually entails, why are businesses working with us. So when we work with email data, we're predominantly thinking about two distinct services that we as Experian offer that can be combined in certain scenarios to provide a more comprehensive service. The first service I want to talk about, the first part, is our email validation service. What this service does is run a check against an email address in real time while it's being entered into a form, such as what you see on your screen to the left. And what that's doing is determining whether the email is active and accepting mail. The service will also flag certain characteristics around the email being provided, such as whether it's a personal business or a personal or business email, which is what Jordan's entering in here as part of the example. And this flag helps businesses make informed decisions with how to treat an email as part of a broader procedure they have around data. So for example, if a business is concerned about potential third-party disclosures that may be coming through an email, which we'll talk about later, this flag, knowing that it's a business or a personal email, identifying that will help them basically make decisions on whether or not this email should be included in their downstream procedures, or in this scenario, we could even prompt Jordan to enter a personal email with this service. We'll talk about this a little later. The second service we offer is the ability to append emails, or the capability to match an email to an associated name and address. The database we use for this service consists of billions of unique records, and we're constantly monitoring it through a massive network of data sources to see how frequently this email is used and whether or not new emails associated to this individual are coming up. And this allows us to provide email addresses on consumers in scenarios where businesses don't have an email that works or don't have an email at all. Like I said, we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail later on, but especially regarding the association of an email to a person. But for now, I just want to impress upon the group that the interactions that we have with businesses historically have been around challenges with outreach, and without giving too much away on slide 1, identification of consumers. And since we have been working with email since the early 2000s, we've been able to witness a shift in how both businesses and consumers expect to use and interact with each other through this medium, which we'll talk about today. But beyond the thousands of clients really that we've worked with to improve the email data that they work with, the other way we interact with the market and how we form our perspective of the market is through the annual market research white paper that we put together. So to start telling the story of how email data has evolved, I'm going to turn things to Jordan, actually, who is instrumental in bringing this research to life.
Great, John, thanks so much. So yes, in this section, we're going to be talking about how we've seen the use of email really progress over the years, and we'll talk about that market research. So each year, Experian comes out with 2 reports, one that comes up at the top of the year and the second half of the year. And in last year's report, this report actually goes through market research on data quality trends that we're seeing across North America. And in our last report, we saw that with the digital uprise, 69% of the organizations we surveyed say that they're collecting contact data through online applications and form fills. So they're getting their data from places like online shopping carts, membership signups, loyalty program forms, account signups, and other online forms like that. And out of the contact details that they're collecting, say email, phone, address, email has always been the top channel that they're relying on. And we've seen this year over year. Our research shows that almost 3/4 of organizations say email is the top channel that they rely on to reach those customers and stay in touch with them. And as I'm sure you've all been seeing, online engagement has significantly grown over the last decade, which has led to changes in consumer preferences when it comes to shopping, communicating, and overall interacting with different brands digitally. So I've been thinking about what this means from a consumer lens, right? And the convenience that it really brings into our everyday lives. And when John and I were working through this, we started thinking about physical product returns and how online shopping has really shifted what and how we buy, our expectations of the cost of shipping, and the volume of product being processed for returns. So for example, I'm getting married this summer. super excited, super busy, and I'm fully taking advantage of what I can easily order online and return. So yes, I'm ordering extras of everything. And because of this, I'm heavily relying on my email to host my order confirmations, shipping notifications, return labels, and anything like that that keeps me in touch with the brand and the product that I'm ordering. And while I do get those retail updates on my phone, those seem to be more in real time, while I look at email as that true source of files, so almost like a filing cabinet that I can always go back to. And the point is that none of this is happening in store, right? And in turn, it's becoming more important to make sure consumers are having that good, consistent, and personalized experience at each point of their customer journey, from awareness building to consideration to purchase. And again, I'm sure you've all experienced something similar. Another point I want to make here is that retailers have truly pioneered how we interact online and use email across industries. And from a maturity standpoint, they're optimizing how they use email data. So we'll touch on retail again and other examples within that space on how else they're using email and really paving the way for other industries. But again, retailer is a really good starting point to understand the evolution of email data and how much opportunity it carries. So before we get to all of that though, I want to first turn things back over to John to share some usage insights from our products. This really corroborates what our research respondents are telling us.
Cool. Yeah. So, I mean, we're probably going to say this almost every slide that we go through today. And hopefully, if you walk away with anything, it's that more and more commerce is happening online. And it's one thing to read that in the news or in, say, any reports released by businesses or even read it in a research publication like the one we just talked about. But it's another thing to actually quantify what that trend looks like. So 2 slides ago, I mentioned our email validation service, in particular, how it's used in real time and designed to interact with an end user entering their information into a form. So when we think about usage, what we're seeing here actually reflects the amount of times an individual consumer provided an email to our clients in the millions. And throughout the course of this webinar, Jordan and I are going to refer to this premise that more and more engagement is happening online and via email. But the real question is, and what we're going to get into as well, is how does this impact businesses and their data strategy? What are businesses doing to adapt or take advantage of this shift in consumer behavior and expectations? So from where we sit, the biggest and most thematic challenge we have seen across industries is a growing proximity between an individual's identity and their email address. So as Jordan alluded to, the origins of scaled email usage came from retailers looking to conduct low cost but broad reaching marketing campaigns. And the term spray and pray came from this time period. And today it seems very out of sorts with the high bar that we as consumers have for the communication and outreach that we expect from the businesses that we interact with. The principal challenge we're looking to solve in that previous paradigm was to ensure that operationally emails being fed into a work stream would be deliverable, and that the message that they're ultimately putting in that email would just reach an inbox, not necessarily the individual. The goal, given the high volume of mailing, was to protect what's called a sender reputation, or in other words, to safeguard the business's sending email domain from being blocked from email service providers such as Gmail or Yahoo. But if we fast forward today, culturally, we as consumers are more comfortable with our online identity, helped in no small part over the last 3 years by the impact of COVID and the ensuing shutdowns, I should say, of businesses. So let me give you an example. So today, when we think about, say, for example, doing our taxes or applying for a loan or even getting our test results from a hospital, we don't really think too much about using our email to participate in that interaction with those organizations. However, the more we move to associate someone's identity with their email address, the more it presents a problem to businesses and how they had traditionally been tracking and managing these types of customer relationships. The premise of this challenge is that unlike someone's phone or their home address, for example, email is far more transitory and easier for consumers to change. So when you get a new cell phone or fill out the paperwork for a mortgage, you need to provide personally identifiable information such as a social security number. Changing where you live or the phone number you use can be done, but it's not as easily, as using an email, and not without creating or changing a name, I should say, and not without creating a paper trail that can be easily verified through other sources. On the flip side, though, registering an email address doesn't require nearly as much scrutiny. And over the course of this webinar, for example, someone could register dozens of emails under their name and address. So what that leaves us with is a scenario where businesses are needing to adapt to working with digitally sourced data and personalize their interactions with consumers, which for many requires a more proactive approach to data management that they had been used to in the past. And this shift has changed the importance of email from being just a means to communicate with the customer to being an asset that can both help businesses identify and communicate with customers. Next, I'm going to hand the mic back to Jordan, who's going to set us up for the next section of the webinar, where we're going to be talking about how this looks in specific verticals and what they're doing to adapt to these types of changes.
Yeah, thanks, John. So as we kick off this section, and there's a lot here, first I want to circle back to a few slides ago when John walked through the growth of email. And it was really extraordinary growth that we saw over just the last few years and prior to COVID, like John was talking about. And that's really in part due to how long we've been in the space as a business and the breadth of verticals that we serve. So what we're hearing from our clients and seeing in the market is a dramatic increase in online interactions, right? And the use of email. And we talked about retail a little bit, but we're also seeing this across other industries like finance and healthcare too. And we'll get to that. On one end, these industries are dealing with an uprise in competition because of this digital landscape that we live in. And because of that, they're having to personalize interactions with consumers to get their attention. On the other end, businesses find this shift in consumer expectations appealing because of the opportunity to create operational and cost efficiencies for their business over any other previous practice that they've had. And with that in mind, we're going to look at our own data to see who is consuming our services and from what vertical. To put this in context, we're tracking anyone who enters their email information into a form that we service. And this looks like the form in video that John walked through at the top of the webinar. And we're going to share that data here, which is really cool. And first, we want to start with retail. I mentioned it before, but it's hard to talk about email without talking about the retailers. Historically, they've been the biggest client of ours for email solutions, and again, have really paved the way for how email has evolved over the last 2 decades. And for all the retailers on the call, you know that this is a highly competitive marketplace and everyone is competing for those consumers. And the digital landscape is making this so much more challenging. So this is where personalization becomes that critical part of the email strategy. For example, seeing your name on the email subject line, getting a special promo code on your birthday, which I always love, or seeing an email that is targeted content based on what you've been browsing, that goes a long way. And I see this like it's catching your eye when you're scrolling through your inbox that has a lot of emails, right? And this certainly helps make you feel like a valued customer. We actually did a recent case study with IKEA Australia, and they did their own market research that resulted in when they personalized their campaigns, they found that the customer was more likely to spend more per order. So personalization is an important component, but not necessarily the challenge for many. Retailers have, again, pioneered digitization, and if they haven't, they're failing. And if you guys have seen the news about Bed Bath & Beyond, they just announced their bankruptcy recently. And as I was reading up on this, article came across me by Kristen Schwab, and I really thought she said it best. So I wanted to quote her here. And in the article, she's actually quoting Jamie Katz, who's a retail analyst from Morningstar. But she said, when you are buying at Bed Bath & Beyond, you're basically shopping the same product that you would shop at Amazon or Target. The company was too slow to pivot to online shopping, so customers moved elsewhere. As a result, Bed Bath & Beyond got stuck with a lot of stuff, sitting at a lot of stores and staffed by a lot of people. And those costs put the business further in the red, so it's been closing stores and selling off brands to recover cash. So digitizing customer engagement is essential in today's market. We all know that, and that's where email is playing a pivotal role. Whether it's retailers optimizing how they use this channel, or if other industries are starting to build outreach processes. In the same vein, organizations are focusing on the identification of consumer patterns to better segment and build loyalty, which is one way retailers are thinking about innovating their use of the channel as a whole and the data point. But what is new to the conversation we are having with clients about their loyalty programs is that many are now talking about using email or using data to make credit offers. And we heard one client explain it as credit is the new loyalty program. So John will take you through this more in depth.
Yeah. So yeah, I remember when I heard the retailer work with say that, essentially that, extending credit is a function of their loyalty program, that a light bulb went off for me, because I think it kind of characterized a lot of the adjustments that I've seen financial institutions make around email data. So as we've been alluding to throughout this webinar so far, there's just emails playing in a more important role in the ecosystems that FIs need to operate in to remain competitive, which is in turn causing them to think about this email differently. I'm going to talk about two of those changes here. The first shift is not necessarily unique and similar to what we've been saying about retailers, that just more is happening online. So today, when you want to find the best rate for a credit product like a car loan or a credit card, the starting point is increasing online. In fact, 55% more Americans applied for a loan through an online vendor in 2022 than they had in 2021. And the allure of this approach, and the reason so many FIs have followed suit, was that it's allowing customers to see and start considering personalized offers in minutes, which is in certain lending situations, like for example trying to buy a home, really made a significant difference. And the most important part of this trend is that it's kind of considered a win-win for both the FIs and their customers, right? So for customers, for members, for individuals that work with these businesses, this shift is in line with their expectations, right? We want something instantly. We want personalized self-service through a device of our choosing. And for FIs, these consumer expectations are creating new opportunities for improved efficiencies around what are otherwise perpetual objectives, such as customer service or account management, identifying fraud, business development, marketing, and even accounts receivable, or otherwise known as collections. And as I've said earlier, and I will continue to hammer home throughout this presentation, is that increased online customer engagement has left FIs with the challenge of associated with taking in, managing, and consumer email data at scale. And this is just motivated further by the prospect of achieving greater efficiency within their business. The other trend I want to mention in this section is slightly more unique to FIs. Alongside the acceleration of digital commerce, really as a result of COVID and the associated economic conditions, that kind of came with that was the increased acceptance of online payment platforms led by experiences that we're familiar with, such as buy now, pay later, or digital wallets like Apple Pay and Google Pay. For FIs, this trend only further pushes email data closer to someone's identity, and by extension, the decision-making process around extending credit to consumers. And similarly for consumers, this trend further normalizes providing an email as part of the payment or credit application process. One really good example of this trend was in the news recently. So Early Warning Systems, which is or EWS, it's a bank-owned joint venture between some of America's most recognizable largest banks. they announced that they would be launching a new digital wallet to compete with the likes of PayPal, Amazon Pay, or Apple or Google Pay, as I just said. As a consumer, the way that would look to you and I would be that we would provide our email address associated with the bank account that we have amongst the EWS consortium. And that in turn would enable us to log in and pay seamlessly for the items that we already have in our shopping cart. And while this move is being seen as a way for banks to come closer to the arena where credit is being extended easier and earlier, initiatives like these leave FIs with the challenge of having to basically build and maintain a bridge between data coming from digitally friendly sources that are designed to minimize input requirements from us as consumers to the FI's own internal and often older systems designed to support and manage underwriting of credit products. And how this actually pans out and how it's being tackled by business to business can vary. But the underlying task here is that FIs need to manage and think about email data differently to remain competitive and continue to meet consumer expectations. Next, we're going to shift gears away from finance and talk about how email is becoming increasingly important in the healthcare space. And in keeping with the theme of the webinar, healthcare too is going through a significant shift towards digital interactions with patient and members. One stat I think that highlights how significant this shift is says that in March 2020, more than double the amount of Americans accessed their healthcare records online than had in 2019. And as 2020 rolled on, some providers even reported seeing 100x or 100 times more patients visiting their websites to access digital records versus January. And similar to finance, the healthcare ecosystem and the data flowing through it is shaped by both organizations and individuals, but also regulations. In the last 2 years, regulations have played a major role in shaping the space. One big example of that is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which required that Medicaid programs keep people continuously enrolled until the end of the public health emergency caused by COVID. So from February 2020 to September 2022, total Medicaid enrollments have grown by 20 million people, sustained by the fact that states are not allowed to disenroll people from coverage. However, at the end of March 2023, Medicaid programs will need to resume what would be their normal operations, and part of that exercise will be to recertify Medicaid enrollments. And part of that process includes outreach, and traditionally that's been achievable through phone calls. However, the unprecedented volume of re-enrollments have caused many to turn to, you guessed it, email, which is seen as a more cost-effective way to cover the ground needed to review the re-enrollment backlog. Another trend we see in this space it can also be kind of chalked up to helping engage with and shape the behavior of patients' behavior. Or sorry, the patient interactions with the healthcare providers that they work with. So for example, healthcare providers are using email to help notify patients, and this should seem recognizable to everyone on this call, of upcoming appointments, as well as prompting them to take preliminary steps to make the appointment useful, such as say notifying people to fast for 24 hours prior to the visit, or ensure their information, insurance information is updated, right? And this not only helps reduce the amount of time that patient must spend in the hospital, but it also in turn helps the provider become more efficient with providing healthcare to more patients. Another similar scenario playing out is with insurers and their partnerships with managed care or accountable care organizations. MCOs or ACOs, as they're called, are kind of focused on helping ensure healthy outcomes for patients, and similarly see email as a more cost-effective way to help influence members to make intelligent choices or decisions about their health, such as notifying members to follow certain procedures if they're, say, pregnant or have a chronic health problem, which can in turn prevent more costly complications down the line. And to Jordan's point earlier, what's interesting about these challenges emerging from these two verticals is that they're experiencing the same kind of issues that retailers had with scaled email usage over a decade ago, meaning that their scaled up usage of email is resulting in healthcare providers sending emails to a lot of old, inactive emails, which in turn are blacklisting their email domains and preventing them from actually successfully delivering an email. And for me, what's kind of interesting about the use of email in healthcare and finance is that on one hand, these industries are finding ways to scale up their use of email and are uncovering new and unique challenges that reflect, the challenges of the industries that they work in. On the other hand, however, their increased use of email is producing recognizable and thematic challenges across these verticals. And as a result, what we're seeing is a theme of best practices that can be applied independent of industry. And so for more on that, I'm going to hand things back to Jordan.
Thanks, John. So in this, the first and fundamental challenge that came to mind and what we're hearing from our customers is, how do you send sensitive information via email? And as John spoke about, we see this especially in those industries that we just discussed, like finance and healthcare, where there's a lot of sensitive information, right? And many are solving this problem with online portals. The way in which customers are using this is that they will send an email to the recipient with a call to action to log into their portal, which is where they can access this information. And one common way in healthcare, at least, is through MyChart. And kind of going off the stats that John just shared, we found that 83% of people access their information through patient portals. We also see this happening with a lot of banks and other FIs using their websites and online account management, which I'm sure you've all seen when you're doing online banking. And ultimately, this allows these businesses to securely share that sensitive information while really meeting the consumer preferences. In turn, and I think John mentioned this as well, we're seeing costs and operational efficiencies by engaging the consumers. Emailing sensitive information is usually top of mind as a key challenge, especially when it comes to avoiding those third-party disclosures and maintaining compliance. And this actually brings us to our next slide, and we're going to look at more challenges that we're seeing when it comes to email. So when we talk to these industries about their email strategies and how our email tools may fit into their plans, we're seeing common pain points and really just uncertainty in a world where everything is digitized and personalized. Everything we do right now is online. And as we get into that, I first want to give you the biggest takeaway, and that it's important to capture data right from the source. And we'll get into the weeds of this later, but being proactive about the quality of the data is essential, and that will be a really great solution as we're looking at these challenges. So this is what we're hearing from our clients. Number one, compliance. Compliance is a big concern and challenge, especially for those compliance teams within each business. They want to effectively and efficiently send communication while making sure it's secure, and that's what we were touching on before. And as an organization, it's important to be mindful and do your due diligence yourself to make sure your recipients have the chance to opt out of email, the unsubscribe button at the end of every email, and really avoid those third-party disclosures. So again, circling back to those online portals, you want to avoid sending any sensitive information, especially to the wrong person or to the wrong inbox. And that's where we're seeing those innovations there. Next up is consumer preferences. And this is another area where organizations must be really mindful about, since not everyone wants to be communicated with via email. This is where personalization can play an important role because it can catch the attention, especially in an overloaded inbox. You can also consider adding other attributes around buyer propensity to better understand which recipients actually want to be communicated with through email. We heard one client describe it as really meeting the client where they're at. And lastly, we see a challenge in change management for some organizations, especially those industries that are just starting to digitally transform. their process and their outreach programs. So to see the full benefit of an email strategy, your team must be on board, right? And it's important to acknowledge the challenge of going from manual outreach via, say, cold calling to digital outreach like we see with email. And this really, to solve for this, you want to think about those user-friendly tools that make maintaining data quality and using valid emails easy. You really want to make the lives easier of the end users, right? And that's getting these types of tools. So keeping this in mind, we want to discuss how we can help you build that reliable email strategy and what to think about with those right tools. In this section, we want to take a longer look at our products, see how they work, and discuss how our clients are really using them. And maybe this will spur some ideas for your organization and your email strategy. So to get us started, John talked about how businesses are looking to get the best consumer email earlier, which is what we really want to consider when looking at these best practices. Email goes stale at 3% each month. I just find that to be a crazy stat. I'm going to say it again because it's crazy. Email goes stale at 3% each month, which is significantly more than any other contact data like phone and address. It's so easy to change and add new emails, right? And not so easy to change your phone number or a postal address. Your email 6 years ago will probably not be viable today. For instance, for me, I currently own and regularly manage 4 different emails, which is a lot. But 6 years ago, I had a university email that I used regularly, and I don't anymore. And probably 12 or more years ago, I had another school email that I haven't used in that time, and maybe a few AOL emails floating around that I absolutely don't touch now.
Jordan, let me jump in for a second because I want to add some color to this. So to your point about emails changing quickly. So what we see in the email append database that I referenced at the beginning of the webinar is that every 90 days, there are 820 million changes to the name, address, and email combinations that we see in our database. So just another proof point that things are rapidly evolving and changing in the space.
Oh, wow. Yeah, thanks for that, John. That's crazy. 820 million changes in a contact database every 90 days. I think that just goes to show you that if you're relying on email to reach your customers, then it's so important to have these practices in place to maintain that email quality. And going off of that, if you have an influx of bad emails, whether they're invalid or outdated, that could lead to negative impacts downstream. If a misspelled, misformatted, or outdated email makes it to your segment, say, that you're sending a campaign to, you're essentially wasting costs and efficiencies by sending to that inbox. And not only that, but you're risking being blacklisted if you send high volumes of emails to bad addresses, which we have seen in the past. So therefore, you want to make sure there is data quality checks in place, such as our email validation, and at different points of entry and management throughout the process. So all in all, we believe that the best email comes directly from the consumer themselves, and John will touch on this further.
Yep, so we're back to this slide, or at least this image of the email validation service. And let's start off where Jordan left off, which in my mind is honestly the most important tenet of any data quality strategy, which is the most accurate information comes from the consumer directly. In that sense, you kind of want to design the point you capture their information to be interactive, as I mentioned, providing them the opportunity to make changes to their email if what's provided isn't determined useful. So one way to achieve this dynamic is through the email validation service that you're seeing here, which is embedded into this mock-up of a form where the service is looking at an email. And in this scenario, it's looking at jordantetler@experian.com. And on the right hand of the screen, we can see the response from the service, which is telling us a few details about the email that Jordan's providing. So in this case, Jordan has entered her Experian email, which the service is indicating is not an email managed by Jordan, the individual, but rather Experian, the entity. And given the scenario we're in as a business, right? If I'm a business and I'm thinking about using the service, we may accept this input by Jordan. And we can use this email knowing that there's a chance that Experian could review the content, or potentially that Jordan may not work at Experian any longer. Or alternatively, what we can do is customize this API to prompt Jordan to provide a different email, such as her personal email, instead.
Yeah, so when used in real time, adding Experian's email validation service at the top of funnel and ideally in a position to interact with consumers directly both creates one, a quality control check to flag potentially bad emails, but it also enables the customer to provide what they consider their best email to communicate with them through. So what is happening in real time is that the service is able to tell you key pieces about the email. Like, one, does the email and domain combination exist, and is it accepting mail? Two, is the email a business email and potentially a risk if communicating sensitive information? And three, is the email potentially nefarious, such as a fake or temporary email, or if the email is a known spam trap, right? We want to stay away from those. However, the service can also be used in bulk too, and taking in large files and flagging which emails are considered viable. Given that email data changes so frequently, many businesses opt to run email hygiene projects in scenarios where they don't have access to forms consumers are entering information in. Maybe the data is potentially stale, or right before a major campaign or initiative, sending these emails through a hygiene project, it helps maximize their impact. And approaching email hygiene in this order helps grow the pool of usable emails, right? But what happens when email data is known to be bad, or has it gone bad over time?
Yeah, so, and this is kind of where our email database usually factors in. So when an Experian client doesn't have access to the data entry point for customers, such as we were sort of seeing on the mock-up web form, or have acquired a database, or just have an old database and some of the data in that database has gone stale, they can turn to our email append service to help identify the best email for the individual they have on file. So clients will either come to us with a single project, or have a regular cadence in mind where they want to identify the best, this is quotes, best consumer email we have on file for the individual in their database. Meaning the underlying premise there that the email has gone bad or had never been captured. That aspect of the service leverages a massive network, and I guess I should specify here, the ability to identify what the best consumer email on file is of potentially many, is using a massive network of data providers constantly monitoring the internet to identify when the email was first created and how frequently it's being used, so that we can identify which is likely the best email to reach this person on. Practically speaking, what happens is the client will send us the names and addresses, and where applicable, the email they have on file to determine what is bad. I'll turn things back over to Jordan, though, to sort of talk about what we're doing on our side.
Yeah, thanks, John. So on the Experian side, what we're doing is taking that file in to make sure it's formatted and structured to match against a database of 1.7 billion records that have opted in for communication and is CCPA compliant. Once a match has been made to the name and address on a record, the service then looks to determine which of the potentially multiple emails associated with persons on file to determine which is the best email to return to our client. One of the things to call out too is that if it's necessary, the email data will go through, the email data that Experian appends is validated using our email validation service once more before passing it back to the usable email, passing back the usable email to the client and stripping out any undelivered or problematic emails that we might catch. The average match rate of this exercise tends to hover between 65 to 75% and can be set up automatically to process these files, say, on a daily basis. In a combination and orchestrated together like this, our email validation and append services can be plugged into our clients' work streams or customer user experience to help ensure confidence that the email data that you're working with is correct and can really help with any exciting initiatives. And this also keeps pace with consumer expectations and, of course, that competitive market we all see. Awesome. So we covered a ton today, from seeing our own data as Experian and how email has evolved over the last 2 decades. And we've made it to the Q&A portion of today's call. So we're already seeing some questions come through. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A function. You can find that right on your screen. Let's see what we have here. All right, so the first one I'm seeing is that if email is the top channel, is text message the second? Where does text message fall in the spectrum? And from my perspective, from the research we've done and the white papers that you'll find on edq.com under resources, that yes, phone is runner-up when it comes to email. And it actually says a bit over half of organizations rely on phone to reach their customers. John, anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, if we wanted to, we could probably do a webinar on phone as well. Though I think for me, what's unique about email is that there's a broadening applicability to it versus phone, which I think has, always been an important part of conducting business. I just think that the usage of phone too is adapting. So it's hard to say which channel is better. I think from our perspective, the broadening applicability of email plus the cost efficiencies that kind of come with the sort of automated components of running and using email not necessarily make it the better channel, but make it more enticing to talk, to sort of incorporate and build out new strategies around. So it's a tough question to really answer, but it's a good one, and one we could potentially follow up with a webinar, Jordan.
Yep, stay tuned for the phone webinar. Great. Okay, you mentioned consumer preferences. How does Experian determine if a consumer prefers email?
Yeah, I can answer that. So, I mean, as Experian, we have lots of consumer preference data, and one of the things that's often asked is how do we layer in, how can we help determine, I think Jordan mentioned this earlier too, how can we help determine whether this person is going to be receptive to email, right? I think one of the things that you hear when talking with clients is that they view some of their database as certain, I guess you could say, demographics within their database are more receptive to email versus phone. So, the thing that we often do to help clients be more concrete in that determination is use some of Experian's other data assets, such as Consumer View, which can help identify which consumers are going to be receptive to which channels. And that's often sort of part of the sort of hygiene projects that Jordan and I were kind of reviewing earlier.
Okay, we have another interesting one. We have a lot coming through. Yeah. This question is, how have you noticed the change in ability to capture email data with the usage of Hide My Email via Apple phone users? Any thoughts on that? I'm
not quite sure I'm familiar with what, I mean, so I've I've heard of this, but I haven't come across it honestly that often. I think it's I'd have to take a rain check on this question because I do know that has come up, but I think that the way in which businesses have dealt with it kind of is either to take things out or sort of take that information out of sort of the program that they're using email in, or do some workaround to identify who that person is in potentially a different email. Again, I think that if you take steps like that, though, you have to sort of consider what the user experience is like. And I don't know if there's a conclusion yet on how to really deal with that effectively.
Okay, and let's see here. You said that your database sees 820 million changes every 90 days, which I thought was a crazy stat. Why do you think there are so many changes?
Oh, well, I mean, so there's a lot of reasons why this database moves. And I think, one example would be, for example, if you were to sign up or apply for a loan using your name, address, and one email, and then applied for a timeshare event with your name, address, and another email, what we would do is look at those two scenarios and make a determination as to which is the email that's more, I guess you could say, serious in that scenario, right? What would the consumer what type of email would a consumer provide their bank versus, say, a retailer? And what we're doing is ranking those and in determining that the email you're providing your bank may be a better quality email for you to use versus, say, the one you're signing up with repeatedly, for sweepstakes, for example. So that's just one example of why the database would change, right? The best email associated to the name and address could change in ranking based on changes like that. And that's just one example. There's many. You could move, you could come up with a new email, and so on. So there's lots of different ways in which this database moves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking about all the emails that I have changed or had in the past and the reasons why, I may not use them anymore. Thank you for that. All right, let's see. In the research done so far, are there any use cases where email does not perform as well as other contact channels? This is an interesting one.
It's again, I think you would have to look at the businesses, right? So I've seen, bake-offs, A/B testing that, financial services have done between email and phone, and found that email does better in certain scenarios and not others. And I think it kind of depends on what your messaging is and what you're trying and what you're ultimately trying to get out of that interaction. I think, Jordan, you gave a really good example, right? So you use email as sort of this, you put it in a file cabinet, right? So what you're doing in that scenario is you're maintaining information that helps you engage with that, I guess, various retailers you're looking at right now to plan your wedding. But the flip side is you also mentioned phone. So you mentioned that's more of a real-time scenario that you'd be expecting a message. So I think there's this sort of balance you need to make between what your objectives are and what the experience is for the consumer, right? So if you're trying to update them with shipping information, maybe a phone or a phone call, not necessarily a phone call, but a text message might be a more viable option for you in that scenario, say, versus sending receipts or mailing labels too.
All right. Wow, guys, lots of questions. Okay, I'll take this one. We mentioned market research and our white paper. Can you please share where that research came from? So yes, we can definitely send it through, and you can also find it on our website. Again, we put out to a year, and our last one really honed in on data quality, contact data, and what we've seen in the market so far. So you can find that under resources, and we'll also send it through. Okay, and also, is there an opportunity to try out the solution? Yes, we do have free trials. You can also find them on our website. So definitely you can go in and plug in your email and see what you get back. John, anything to add to that one?
No, I think you did a good job.
Okay. Can you recap your approach to finding the best email? How does that work and why is that important?
So I'm assuming that's in reference to the append database, the email appending database. So the information, and this is an old database, I should say. This database began in the early 2000s, and it was built through a network of partners that are capturing information on signups and forms, and et cetera. And what we're doing in that scenario is we're providing the consumer at that point the ability to opt in. Or opt out of communication via email. And so the entire database is built of sort of opted in emails, if you will. And the network of data providers we're using to actually collect emails is also being used, as I mentioned, to monitor the web for additional data points regarding the individuals we have in this, what's really an identity database around email. And as I kind of just referenced as well, what we're also looking at is kind of where the source is. So if you're, again, signing up for a bank account versus, a timeshare seminar, you're probably going to use a different type of email. And so we associate different weights to what could be considered, if that email is different, the best email. And part of the calculus we use, and I think this is fairly standard, is to sort of look across that network and find which of the emails are most frequently being used as another indicator of whether it's the best email or not, but also the recency of creation, right? So if someone's creating an email, if someone created an email yesterday, the likelihood that that's going to be a way to sustain communication with that individual is not high. So we kind of factor that in as well. That's kind of a high level what it is. The rest of it, you kind of chalk it up to secret sauce, but that's generally how we're looking at it and making those decisions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, it looks like that's all that's coming through at the moment. So thank you, John, so much for joining me on this webinar today. And again, everyone, the webinar will be circulated in the next few days. So definitely keep an eye out for that, and always feel free to reach out to John and I to learn more. We would love to set up a meeting with you to discuss.
Thanks, everyone.